Hello, everybody. Yeah, so excited to talk about this book about bookstores in a bookstore with book people. And I thought we'd start just by, pointing out there's this interesting theme in this book where quite a few different characters, I think, arrive at this conclusion. They don't like the word store. They think store is like almost an offensive thing to call a bookstore when you think about how much bookstores really offer people, the kind of magic that it is to be surrounded by books and people who love books. And so, I think of that now when we look at the folks all assembled here, united by their love of reading. It's just a magical thing. And so it strikes me that, you've had an amazing job over the past years to be the chronicle of the people who steward this experience for others. And I guess I'm just wondering, was that as fun as it sounds?
Yes, and thanks so much for having me here, and everybody for being here. I think this is my first event where I didn't drag my mother or any of my friends here, and so I'm always surprised anybody shows up, and I'm very grateful. And bookstore people, as I write in the book, are interested in bookstores, rightly so. And it was a delight. I tried to visit as many bookstores as I could, and I do write in the introduction, I don't want booksellers to seem snobbish or elitist by preferring the term bookshop, and not everyone does, but I think it suggests a nice distinction about bookshops, bookstores, as places of community, of communion. I thought about, I don't write about this in the book, but I thought about the other kinds of places that we think of as shops, coffee shops, or places where I like to roost and hang out and loiter and linger. And so much of the magic of a bookstore is not just in this transactional nature of buying a book, but it's about the experience, it's about the atmosphere, it's about conversation and relationships. And I think shop is just a warmer, cozier way to capture that sentiment.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about how increasingly elusive that ability to be in a totally non-transactional community space really is in our moment now. But maybe to start, as was mentioned in the great introduction, you began writing 2 books about bicycles, and I thought maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how you went from bicycles to books.
Sure. Well, as people have pointed out, they both start with B, and which maybe the next book should be about bakeries, which I also happen to enjoy. But both, and I'm an academic historian. I'm a professor at James Madison University, and we trained historians are often taught to try and divorce ourselves from our scholarship and to try and be objective and look in the past with some distance and almost as a kind of alien place that we can see more clearly if we don't have a personal investment. And basically, I think that's garbage. And so both bikes and bookstores started from a very personal place. And I was in New York City riding around on a bicycle, which was a joyful, wondrous, and scary experience. And I was aware that there are other cultures and cities around the world where bicycles were much more popular, where cycling from A to B was much easier. And I, as a historian, began to wonder about the kind of historical choices that made it difficult to bike or that encouraged or discouraged certain forms of transportation, and was kind of just a transportation geek. And that was the impetus for that. And as a lifelong lover of books, and as somebody who was reading lots of books in graduate school, I had this deep-rooted interest in literature, but I really wasn't aware of the magic of bookstores until I lived in New York City. I grew up in suburban Baltimore in a town called Columbia, Maryland, which has its own interesting history. But my local bookstore was a Barnes & Noble, and I occasionally went there to buy a book. This girl I liked, who's now my wife, used to have a poetry workshop, so sometimes I'd go to see her. But for the most part, it wasn't a passionate relationship about the bookstore. It was about her. Speaking of her, so it was really through her experience that I began to unlock, for me, how amazing these institutions were. So after college, we moved to New York City. I began a PhD program in American history. She was looking for a job, walking around Manhattan, and saw this great little indie called 3 Lives and Company, which if you go to New York, you should definitely visit in the West Village. And it has it at the time had 3 employees, and they were lifers. And it just so happened that there was an opening, and she was really into poetry, and that was a kind of weakness of the staff. And she got a job there and worked for 8.5 years. And when she came home, I was surprised by how rare our conversations were about literature. So I was reading all day for graduate school. She was reading a lot to recommend to people. But what she talked about were the customers, the conversations, sometimes the eccentrics, the dogs that came in. And these were personalities that she began to tell tales of, who became figures in her life, and then eventually by proxy in my life as well. And it was a community space. And again, it wasn't for me growing up, this relationship to bookstores, but I saw for some subset of people that this was part of their either daily, weekly, monthly, seasonal kind of experience. And for them, this bookstore was the most important anchor in their community, and is what made to them this neighborhood feel so neighborhoody and worthwhile. And so I figured I should write a book about it.
Yeah. It's really interesting because as we all know, bookstores, I think, are facing difficult times. Many closed during the pandemic. Book sales are down. And yet bookstores loom really large in the kind of popular imagination. People love them. One data point that you mentioned toward the end of the book is there's a Goodreads list that has, I think, something like 352 books about bookstores. And so I was looking through that, and most of them actually are fiction, are novels, I noticed, and there's not a ton of books about the kind of material reality of bookstores approached in a nonfiction way. And I'm wondering, this is such a awesome, interesting, fascinating topic. People are responding, I think, in a really, energetic way to this book. They're excited about the topic. I'm wondering why it took so long for someone to have the idea to write a history of bookstores when, we've got You've Got Mail, we've got best-selling novels by people like Louise Erdrich and Geraldine Brooks about bookstores. Why are we so obsessed with kind of the mythos of bookstores, but it took so long for someone to say, hey, let's talk about the brass tacks. Let's really look at this reality.
Yeah, I was surprised that a version of this book really hadn't been written before, and why that is, I don't know, but thank you to everybody else who neglected the subject. And I write this in the book, when I told people what I'm working on, this history of the American bookstore, the most common question I got, other than when will you be finished, which is not a good question to ask an author, even if he's your son, was, so the question everyone asked me was, are you going to write about You've Got Mail, which probably most of you are familiar with, although I've learned that it is somewhat generational, and I guess I'm old enough that there are enough people considerably younger than me who aren't familiar. But I do write about You've Got Mail, and there are, as you point out, so many books and movies set in bookstores, because I think they can capture so many different kinds of mood, romance, mystery. They're such enchanting spaces, and I won't say it as well as I do in the book. Not that I'm bragging about how well I say things in the book, but a lot of drafts go into this. I'm just spitballing here. But I say something to the effect of bookstores can also be the actors They're not just passive backdrops. And really, that's the point of the book, is that bookstores are influencers. And bookstores can shape communities, can shape culture, can shape literature, and down to the individual level can shape our lives.
Yeah. So the way the book is structured, it's in this really cool way. You kind of take us through time, focusing on a specific bookstore in each era, starting with Benjamin Franklin in the 1700s in Philadelphia, and bringing us all the way through into the Amazon era and the kind of indies versus Amazon dynamic that we're in right now. And there's just the stores are very viscerally brought to life. Their characters, their customers, their owners, their staff, and it just strikes me like it must have been so hard to find a lot of this information. Like, there's so many wonderful details. One of my favorite is that the famous playwright Tennessee Williams worked in Gotham Books in New York City for like 2 days or something, and got fired or quit. Couldn't wrap packages to save his life, right? Like, couldn't do the gift wrap. How do you find this stuff? It strikes me that such of the life of a store, but in particular bookstores, especially because so many of them fail, is just really ephemeral. And I'm just curious what the process of the archival research that you did was like.
So writing a survey history of the American bookstore from Benjamin Franklin to the present seemed ungovernable in a lot of ways, and it took me a very long time to think of a structure that would be readable, but also be fun for me as a historian to really get into the weeds, because I love doing research. That's the most fun part. So some of the chapters and bookstores that I profile, I selected because there were more voluminous records. And you referred to the Gotham Book Mart, which was run by a woman named Frances Stelloff, who worked there till she was 100 years old. And she started this shop in the 1920s. And it started as a kind of avant-garde, artsy bookstore and flourished as a home for modernists and many other writers who really weren't supported by most other bookstores. And I don't have any images here, but I saw a photo once of her desk, and it was like, I don't know, it had like 80 papers on it, and I start the chapter by describing her desk, which had files and file folders and staples and paper clips and cups of cantaloupe. She really liked fruit. But she was just a packer. Like, she kept everything to a fault, and her shop was overflowing with stuff. So, and because her shop became famous, and even though at first it struggled, by the 50s and 60s, it was on the map, sort of like a City Lights became in San Francisco. I think they had some sense that saving materials was important, and there are boxes and boxes of records from this shop at the University of Pennsylvania. So that's just one example. I have a chapter on Oscar Wilde. The founders' papers are in New York Public Library, and there are a lot of other chapters that I started to write that don't appear in the book because I just couldn't get enough source material. So it's not that there's just sources for everything. There's a lot of stories I wish I could have told.
Yeah. So you went to what was available. I guess I'm wondering, one thing that was new to me about this is I just kind of assumed, okay, bookstores are in trouble now because of Amazon and because of the specifics of our moment, where, I think mom and pop, single owner retail is struggling in general. One of the things the books taught me is that actually bookstores have kind of always been in peril. They're always sort of under threat, either because they are the sort of sites of radical ideas, and so there's sort of political pressure on them at various times, including now. I mean, we have, literally Benjamin Franklin helping to start a revolution, but we also have books getting banned, today in our day and age. So it's partially that, but it's also because they are fundamentally not transactional in the way we were talking about. Yes, technically they're stores. They have to exist in the world of capitalism, but they're about something so much more. And that tension, I think, is really hard to navigate, of being a non-commercial, commercial space. So yeah, maybe just talk little bit about how like bookstores are always kind of trying to do this really difficult thing in every era.
Yeah, so the whole notion of a book business to some degree feels oxymoronic. And, you see a book and there's a price stamped on it and a barcode, and it doesn't, I hope you all buy this book. But there's also something that just sort of, we think of books as these kind of sacrosanct, near holy objects. And when my wife was working at Three Lives, and these customers who came in every day, they would spend an hour there. There's this guy named Abel, who now there's Abel's stool. There was one stool in the shop, and Abel always sat there. Abel didn't buy any books, so Abel took a lot of time, and everybody loves Abel, including me, and he occasionally buys books. But this was not a person who was going to benefit the shop financially, but he's part of the community. And so many events that bookstores do, so much of their mission is beyond making money, and that comes at a cost. And the theme of precarity is an enduring theme throughout bookselling history. So Benjamin Franklin is the first bookseller I profile, who's got a handsome portrait at the state capitol, which I walked through just before this event. Very nice state capitol you have here. I think it might be the prettiest I've ever seen. Amazing. And there he was, and I talked to him for a couple minutes. But back when he was starting, he had a problem. People say Americans don't read today. Well, colonists didn't read. Most of them couldn't read, right? Like, the rate of illiteracy was tremendously high. So there's a very small pool of potential buyers, and books were very expensive then, comparatively so. So the challenges are different from every generation, but it's always been a low margin business. It's always attracted people who are interested primarily in something else, even if they're hopeful to make money. Their motivation is usually about spreading a love of literature, or it's a political ideology. It could be radicalizing people. It could be promoting banned books. It could be, all sorts of ideological centered bookstores. But the financial motive is often secondary, tertiary, and in some cases in the book of people I profile, non-existent. They're hoping just to survive in order to be able to accomplish some other goal. So how many bookstores we have today could be seen as, people like to ask me, are bookstores dying? And how many bookstores relative to the past? And in some ways, it's a tale of decline. There are many fewer bookstores today than there were 20 or 30 years ago. But in other ways, it's sort of remarkable that there are as many as there are, and that there are bookstores like this that are still so obviously prospering with community, with spirit, with sidewalk sales, and all the rest.
Yeah. And, maybe because of that precarity and that the fact that people are in this business for reasons that are larger than just the business, it does seem that I became convinced reading this that bookstores are weirdly like amazing places to look at to understand the tensions of a particular moment, right? Whether that's like the threat of fascism, you write about, or the struggle for racial justice or other forms of social justice, or right now kind of our anxiety about hyper-capitalism, right? I mean, you can see it all right here in the store. And I hadn't thought of them as like amazing kind of little litmus tests for what the moment is, but that really seems to be true.
Yeah, I think that's a more articulate way of putting it than I wrote in the book. But one of my favorite lines from doing I did a lot of oral history interviews. I spent a lot of time in bookstores, and I was in this little shop. This was a bilingual nonprofit shop in a mostly Spanish-speaking neighborhood. And I'm interviewing the owner, and this guy walks in, and the owner says, "Oh, you should talk to him. Not only is he a regular, but he worked his whole life in a bunch of different bookstores." And so I go over to him, I say, I'm writing this book, can I interview you? And he says, no. I'm like, okay. And then I go back to the owner, and then like a solid several minutes passes, and he walks back over to me and he says, you know what? Bookstores are weird, man. And I was like, yeah, they are weird. Yeah. They are so weird. And really, the point of the book is trying to answer that question, is what, maybe more euphemistically than weird, unique, special, distinct. Because they function in a way that no other kind of store does.
Yeah. And I think that's increasingly hard in our moment. I mean, you do end the book talking about Amazon, and there's a line, if bookstores were animals, they'd be on the list of endangered species. And I think we all feel that. At the same time, we see the rise of book talk, right? And as in like TikTok for books. And this sort of resurgence of interest in not only print books, but bookstores as spaces. And so, how, for people who like share this anxiety, who love books, like how would you kind of take the pulse of the moment and tell us about where we are right now? I mean, what are the challenges we're facing? Is the model really under threat? Or is there a reason for hope? How should we kind of feel about this moment in the precarious story of the book business?
There are a lot of challenges, some of which are enduring. It's a very low margin business that remains. The prices are controlled by the publishers, not the booksellers. They can offer a discount, but other costs go up, labor, rent. And then there's challenges in terms of number of readers and other kind of macro issues to contend with. But I also think there's a lot to be optimistic about. The great decline in the number of bookstores has leveled off and stabilized. There are new kinds of people getting into book selling, new kinds of bookstores, new kinds of readers. Last night, apparently, was a packed house of a younger demographic who were, into... was it Amanda Foodie who was here? Is that how you say your name? She was one, yes. Okay, yes. Well, my son loves her books, and I told her I was going to be at the same festival she was at, and I got some cred, some street cred from my son. So there's different genres. People are reading different kinds of books. So bookstores are changing. Some, they're finding different ways to engage with the community. And I think the business will continue to evolve. And as long as we keep supporting them, and I think there are good reasons to think that people will. And for many reasons, the things that we love about bookstores, this in real life experience, this sensory atmosphere, as that experience becomes rarer, the value hopefully will become only more obvious.
Do we have time for one more question, or should we open it up to the audience? Yeah, I mean, is there anything, maybe just one more before we ask you all, did you learn anything about kind of what specifically is needed to make this easier, to try to preserve this kind of space? Is it simply just about us kind of buying more books, or like buying fewer books from Amazon? Or are there kind of more structural things that need to change in terms of, the way that publishers charge bookstores or that kind of thing?
Yeah, this could be a question for our booksellers here. There are a lot of issues in terms of how people could help support bookstores. Obviously, buying books at the bookstores. Indie booksellers will tell you, and the American Booksellers Association, which is the large trade group of brick and mortar bookstores, they're operating on many different fronts, convincing people to shop in person, not on Amazon. But they also think that they need the FTC and federal legislation to curb the influence of monopolistic power, namely Amazon. And I write just briefly about it in the book, but there's a much larger story there. And there are things other countries that have done to uplift bookstores as a kind of part of their cultural heritage and have enacted laws to try to encourage in-person book buying and discourage online book buying. So some of it is individual choice. Some of it, and this goes back to the bicycle, does it have to be so easy to get in a car? And does it have to be so cheap and easy? And these things, of course, take on a different tenor in the sort of birthplace of capitalism. And, that's a whole larger and longer story.
Yeah, and any questions from the audience? We've got a mic coming around.
Yeah, thanks for being here, both of you. You mentioned a nonprofit bilingual bookstore. Past decade or so, there's been a lot of nonprofit bookstores, ones that have missions specific to raising money for AIDS patients or providing employment to at-risk kids or supporting adult literacy. I'm curious, did you write about that or look into that, and how nonprofit bookstores are similar and or different from other bookstores?
Yeah, that's a great question. And speaking of precarity, congratulations on the Mets from another entity that was thought dead and has resurged. So yes, there has been, first of all, tracking the number of bookstores at any given time, which I've tried to do, and I think have done as good a job as any reasonable person can do, is very, very difficult. And in modern times, the American Booksellers Association tracks these things. The United States Census tracks these things, and neither is perfect. So that's just a disclaimer about data. But it is evident that there have been an increasing number of nonprofit bookstores, and some, like the one I was referencing, and I think some of the ones you were talking about, start as entities whose mission from the beginning is to do something other than to make money. But there are a lot of other bookstores that began as traditional bookstores and then are converting to nonprofit for a variety of reasons, fiscal health, but also because they are sort of want to change how customers and the community members think about them. So the Seminary bookstore in Chicago, near the University of Chicago, it was a co-op model, which has its own, but it never paid any dividends and it never made any money, became a nonprofit bookstore. And there's some other weighty bookstores like that have made the shift and are trying to lean into this notion that bookstores are more than just about selling a book, and that they do provide community services, and so therefore maybe they should be thought as such. So that certainly has indeed been a trend in the last decade or so and seems to be picking up steam.
Thank you. So I'm thinking about Philadelphia and Benjamin Franklin, and assuming that his bookstore predated any library there. I don't know if you can say
Well,
that.
he helped start a library himself,
Okay.
right? And his first bookstore, he was fairly young, so he came from Boston, he was a printer, and he came to Philadelphia to basically run away from his family and start a print shop here, and gradually got into book selling. And the word bookstore didn't even exist yet, and his bookstore wouldn't really read like a bookstore to you because he sold books, but it was also a print shop. It was a post office. Mm-hmm. He sold lots of other things, including very good chocolate that he advertised and probably snacked on. So it was a kind of, he wore many different hats, and the bookstore sort of was this manifestation of all these different roles that he had. This was basically simultaneous to him starting a reading group, which then became the genesis for having books to create a library. And then, of course, he created, this great library in the University of Pennsylvania and got into electricity and all sorts of other things, and then left off book selling, still relatively early in his career.
So that's one example of the broader question of what is the relationship between those early bookshops and libraries in a broader context?
Yeah, so libraries back then were all subscription-based, including his was basically just for his friends at first to use, and they all had to pay. So there were circulating libraries, but they were cost-based. And what we know of as free libraries, which are funded by taxpayer monies, weren't popularized until the late 19th century, so over 100 years after Franklin's bookstore. But when they became popularized, booksellers panicked, and the booksellers trade groups tried to shut them down, didn't want them opening in their communities, and saw them as competition. And now you see that bookstores and libraries are often partners and are, again, promoting similar kind of missions, and will often pool resources to bring in big name authors and all sorts of things.
Thank you. Hello. One of the things I think is really interesting is how the bookstore is evolving as a cultural symbol online as an aesthetic. So it's almost going beyond its function as a bookshop and sort of more as a background, an artistic background. So I'm curious to know what you think sort of about that cultural symbolism evolution and how it's kind of removing itself from its original purpose.
So books have long had appeal as material objects, right? It's not just the text themselves that attracts us to the stories, and it was really the birth of the bookstores that helped do this. So Benjamin Franklin, the books that he's selling look like little pamphlets that are stitched together. His common law wife did a lot of the binding. They don't look like books as we know them and aren't beautiful objects. But once we have the sort of emergence of modern American bookstores in the 1820s and 30s, publishers begin to realize they need to make their books look attractive for book browsers who are going to these stores to see what they're going to pick up. And people begin buying books for gifts based on the bindings, spending extra money for fancy bindings, and the bookstores start to think more seriously about their own aesthetic qualities and about being spaces to capture attention. Now, it's not to be backdrops for Instagram or, on Netflix shows that take place in the Strand or whatever. But I think there is this still sort of enduring thread of the kind of not just magic and power of the bookstores, but the physical and aesthetic beauty of books. And some of that has to do with the materiality, and some of it is our love for stories and books, sorry. And she told me one fist worth, and I think I got too close. That was half a fist. So, we have this kind of human connection to stories, and I think we sort of layer that into the books as objects, and then these houses of books become almost like sanctuaries and can have a kind of religious tenor to them, which I think makes them ripe for storytelling and, adds just kind of visual appeal.
And the smell, you read about the smell in the book. And actually the first thing I heard someone say here today was someone came into the book tent, took a big deep breath through the nose and said, "Oh, the smell of books."
Yes, well, you can go to the tent and buy a little jar of bookstore seeds. I don't know what it is. I was over there. Were you over there? Because I heard you talking about film. I was like, wow, this woman seems really smart. Hope she doesn't come and ask me a question I don't know the answer to. So while you were there, pontificating about something I couldn't quite follow, I was smelling the bookstore, and I write briefly Powell's in Portland bottles of perfume at one point, and I write about Benjamin Franklin's bookstore because I'm trying to sort of capture what was his bookstore like, and it was different and it's loud because they're printing presses and there are these people working them and it's really heavy and there's type that's super heavy. And I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that it smelled terribly. And that's mostly because colonists took a bath usually once a year. as a typical practice. So the people stank. They wore the same clothes. And the books had different kind of I do write about the sort of bindings and ink and other kind of chemicals that create smells and people's obsession with them. And there are some people who just love the smell of a book, and some people who love the smell of a Penguin paperback, and it has to be a Penguin.
Got one right here.
Yeah, so we heard a lot about the future of the bookshop. I'm just wondering, people can now download tons of books online. They can read it in their own comfort, on their laptop, at home, wherever. So that could be a challenge to keep bookshops open, because like storing books, you just cannot store so many books.
Yeah.
So in the digital age, is there a future for the physical book?
Yeah, so certainly when ebooks were popularized, Amazon came out with a Kindle, Barnes & Noble followed slowly and less successfully with its own version. People predicted the end of brick and mortar book selling, and for good reason. Like, the adoption rates for ebooks was just climbing at such a steep rate. And bookstores couldn't sell them. And this was convenient, it was cheap. This was, and Bezos in his sort of PR campaign, referred to this as the printing press, like in terms of the scale of revolutionizing. And it didn't end brick and mortar book selling, but it did crimp it significantly. And there's still plenty of people who read on ebooks, and they're not buying them through bookstores. And the same is true for audiobooks, which have become popular in recent years. And there are, and some of you may be familiar with Libro FM, which is a service where you can download audiobooks but still support brick and mortar bookstores. And there's a thing called bookshop.org where you can buy books, print books, but still support your indie bookstore. And they're actually coming out with a service where you can buy ebooks. But all that said, you're right. The ways that we read matter and influence these spaces. And the more generally that we read or listen in ways other than traditional print publishing creates even more and more challenges for bookstores like this. And I always like to say, I'm a historian, and people like to ask me about the future, but I'm just as bad at predicting the future as everyone else. So it's certainly a big challenge. And yeah, we'll see. History sort of shows that we're bad at predicting, that we had good reason 15 years ago to think that we'd all be reading online all the time, and we're not.
Yeah. Okay, one more question. Anybody? Yeah.
As a historian, you collect a lot of stories, ones you've mentioned that you weren't able to include in the book. Do you have plans to collect and share that material in maybe alternate ways to a book? Or is that anathema to ask?
No.
To a book writer in a bookstore?
That's a good question. I've thought, this book, I wrote those first two books about bicycles. They came out, I ate lunch, and, I gave a talk or two, and my life just went on. This book has been much more popular, and I've met many more readers, which has been great. And I've gotten a lot of responses from people, and the emails almost all go the same way. I loved your book. It's so good. Thank you so much. But you didn't mention so-and-so bookstore. And so, if you write a sequel, be sure to include this or this, So I have kept all those emails. I'm not sure I'd write a sequel. I have considered doing something broader, even though this was so broad, because people have asked me, to write a global history of book selling, or to think about book selling cultures around the world, which I think would be fun, but maybe a big project. And I wish I included more bookstores. some of it was just fitting it in and keeping the book a reasonable size. But I also realized that the bookstores that are name checked tend to go on social media and they say, you know, look, we're in the book. So I should have just listed, you know, every bookstore I could have done. So I certainly have in my mind lots of other stories. And I thought that when the book came out, I would like write little profiles or things, op-eds, and I did some. But I've also just been so busy that it's hard to do. So I don't know, maybe it's a scrapbook or something, Substack. Yeah, that's a good idea, actually. And just like what I stupidly left out of the book. I should call, you know, like, sorry, oops, you know. That's a good idea. Okay, I'm going to call it oops, sorry.
Okay. Turns out we actually have time for even one more question, if anyone has it. Yeah, oh, we do have one.
Thank you. This is kind of regarding your research and writing process. You said how much you enjoy the research process. Did you have to set yourself guidelines, guardrails for how long you would maybe let yourself rabbit hole at a specific bookstore or on a specific topic, a specific chapter? Because I could see, me personally, and probably a lot of us, that I could spend forever in X archive.
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the most, like, the greatest things I've ever heard a scholar, this person was a very famous historian, and he was giving some talk, and I was there. And he said the hardest thing to do is to know when to put the pencil down. And he's right in many ways, because every source you find leads to more sources, and it just can go on and on and on. And I'll just say, having written 3 books now, I think I've gotten better at each one in sort of conceptualizing the book and realizing what's going to fit and what doesn't. And yet, this is both maddening and enchanting in terms of the process. There are so many times when I'm trying to find some detail or the answer to something, and I'm digging and digging and spending so much time. And I know that this is going to result in one sentence, and that the reader it's not even going to be a great sentence. It's just going to result in one, it's like one detail that I need to like figure out. And I'm hunting, and knowing how little the sort of payoff is, again, if you dwell on that, can be really defeating. And yet, I'm still hunting and going for it. And a lot of the research doesn't manifest necessarily, but I think just as a reader, I can tell when I'm reading nonfiction, when I feel like the author has really done their research. And I don't want it to be worn so heavily, but there are ways in which you can sort of, I hope, to sort of build that trust and feeling like you have a trustworthy, companionable, scholarly guide here, even if it's not always sort of hitting you on the head of how the research was done.
Well, thank you also for your wonderful questions. Yeah, please take it from here.
All right. On that note, I will take over.